The ambassador from the northern ridge was mid-sentence when Alaric felt the vibration. Not sound. He had not heard sound in 11 years, but the floor beneath his boots carried a tremor, the kind made by a fist slamming a table, and from the corner of his eye, he caught the blur of motion. Someone had struck the oak surface hard enough to rattle the water glasses. He tracked the lips. Graham, his senior advisor, was seated 2 chairs to his left. Graham's right hand moved to his jaw, scratched once, then dropped. That was the signal. The ambassador had just insulted him. Directly. Something about weakness at the southern border. Alaric let 3 full seconds pass. He had learned years ago that silence after an insult was more devastating than any comeback. Let the man sweat. Let the room feel the temperature drop. Then respond with something so precise, so perfectly aimed, that nobody in the chamber would dare wonder whether the king had missed a single syllable. He looked at the ambassador. Read the man's posture. Shoulders forward, chin lifted, the classic stance of someone who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror and was now waiting for applause from his own courage. Alaric spoke. His voice had always been slightly off, a half-tone too flat, the vowels a fraction too wide. His mother had drilled him for years, made him place his fingers on her throat while she spoke so he could memorize the vibrations of proper pronunciation. He had gotten close enough that people mistook the oddness for an accent, a regional quirk, the kind of thing a king could carry without question. The southern border, Alaric said, and he kept his voice low, because low voices hid imperfections, has held for 11 years under my command. Yours held for 6 months before your own wolves requested reassignment. I would be careful about using the word weakness in this room. The ambassador's face collapsed like a sandcastle meeting the tide. Graham's hand moved again, a single finger tap on the armrest. That meant the room was satisfied. Alaric had landed the blow. He dismissed the council with a nod. The men filed out. Graham stayed. When the doors closed, Graham crossed the room and stood where Alaric could see his lips without turning his head. This was their choreography. 11 years of it. He will push again at the next session, Graham said, and Alaric read each word off the man's mouth like picking fruit from a low branch. Fenwick is funding him. The Northern Ridge has no spine of its own. Alaric nodded. Fenwick, that name had been circling closer for the past 2 years. A slow orbit that was tightening. Lord Fenwick controlled 3 border territories and had the kind of ambition that dressed itself up as concern for the kingdom. Every suggestion he made at council was a chess move. Every alliance he built was a wall around Alaric's authority. But Fenwick did not know. Nobody knew except Graham, Nate, and old Ruth. Ruth had been the palace maid since before Alaric's birth. She had been there the night his mother sat him down in the kitchen, 14 years old, blood still crusted behind his ears, and told him the truth that would govern the rest of his life. You will never sit on that throne if they know. Wolves do not follow broken things. Ruth had been the one who cleaned the blood from his ears that night. She had kept the secret the way old women keep everything, silently and with a ferocity that did not require volume. She dusted his chambers every morning and evening, and she was the only servant permitted in his private study, because she was the only servant who understood why the king flinched when she entered from his blind side. 3 days ago, Ruth had died in her sleep. Alaric had stood at her pyre and watched the smoke rise and could not hear the fire, could not hear the prayers, could not hear the soft crying of the kitchen staff who had loved the old woman for 40 years. He watched their mouths move and read the grief on their faces, and felt his own grief as a stone in his chest, heavy and formless, and too big to carry, but impossible to set down. He needed a replacement, not for Ruth. Nobody replaced Ruth, but the position required filling. Someone had to clean the private quarters, manage his personal chambers, be close enough to the king's daily life that gaps in coverage would raise questions. Graham selected her from the lower household staff. A nobody, a girl with no connections, no family ties to any political house, no ambitions that extended beyond earning enough to send money home. Her name was Sera Maddox, and she was 23 years old, and she arrived at his private quarters on a Tuesday morning carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies and the chaotic energy of someone who had been told she was getting promoted and was still trying to figure out if it was a trap. Alaric watched her from the doorway of his study as she cleaned the outer sitting room. He watched because watching was how he experienced people. Without sound, faces and bodies became his primary language. He read posture and gesture and the tiny involuntary movements that most people never noticed because they were too busy listening to words. Sera moved like someone who had been told to be quiet and was physically struggling with the instruction. Her lips pressed together, released, pressed again. Her hands moved in small gestures even when she was just wiping a shelf, as if she was having half a conversation with an invisible companion. Her shoulders kept rising toward her ears and then dropping, the rhythm of someone swallowing words. She lasted 12 minutes before she broke. She thought she was alone. Alaric had stepped back into the shadow of the study doorway, and she must have assumed he had left, because her mouth opened and did not close for the next 30 minutes. He read her lips from across the room. She told the curtains they were the ugliest shade of green she had ever seen, and that whoever picked them must have been colorblind or deeply disturbed. She informed the fireplace mantel that it was dusty in places that suggested the previous maid had either been very short or very indifferent. She picked up a decorative bronze wolf from the side table, examined it, and told it with tremendous sincerity that it looked constipated. Alaric, for the first time in longer than he could remember, almost laughed. He did not laugh. Laughing was dangerous. The sound of his laugh was one of the things he could not control, could not modulate, could not hear and correct. So he kept the amusement behind his teeth and watched this strange, noisy girl navigate his quarters, like a one-woman theater company performing to an audience of furniture. Over the next week, Sera cleaned his chambers every morning and every evening. She was efficient, he would give her that. The rooms had never been cleaner, but the real performance happened in the margins, in the moments she believed herself unobserved, and Alaric began to arrange his schedule around those moments with a precision he would never have admitted to anyone. He learned things about her. She had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to support them. She called the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Lucy, a power-drunk sock puppet, which was so specifically accurate that Alaric had to press his fist against his mouth to trap the laugh. She referred to his throne room as aggressively beige. She told a potted fern by the window that it was the only honest soul in the whole palace, and she meant it, and the sincerity of her affection for a plant she had known for 4 days was so absurd and so genuine that Alaric felt something in his chest shift, a small tectonic movement, plates sliding against each other in the dark. He ignored it. He was very good at ignoring things. He had been ignoring the silence in his own head for over a decade. But Sera was observant in ways that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Day 3, she was cleaning the study while Graham briefed him on the Eastern trade negotiations. Alaric sat at his desk, reading Graham's lips, responding at the appropriate intervals. Sera worked behind him, dusting the bookshelves, and he thought nothing of it. Later that evening, she returned for the second cleaning. She did not know he was in the adjacent room with the connecting door cracked open. She was talking to the bookshelf. "He does that thing," she said, and Alaric read her lips through the narrow gap. "That thing where he watches mouths, not eyes. Every single person he talks to, he watches their mouth, and his advisor always stands on the same side. Always. Like it is choreographed." She paused, wiped the shelf, moved to the next one. And that door. The servant's entrance. It slammed so hard today that the painting rattled, and he did not even blink. Not a flinch. Not a twitch. Nothing. She stopped wiping, held the cloth in midair, her brow furrowed, and Alaric watched the thought form on her face before it reached her lips. Something is off with this king. She said it to the bookshelf, casually, the way someone might note that the weather looked like rain. No alarm, no accusation, just observation filed away in whatever crowded, chaotic cabinet served as her brain. Alaric closed the connecting door without a sound. He sat in the dark of the adjacent room and felt the first genuine tremor of fear he had experienced since the day the healers told his mother the damage was permanent. Someone was watching him the way he watched everyone else. And she was getting close. Sera Maddox had not intended to become a detective. She had intended to clean rooms, earn her wages, keep her head down, and send enough money home to cover her brother Danny's schooling. That was the plan. Simple, executable. The kind of plan that did not involve royal secrets or palace intrigue, or the growing certainty that the most powerful wolf in the kingdom was hiding something so fundamental that it rewired everything she thought she understood about power. But Sera had a problem. She noticed things. She always had. Her mother used to say she had been born with her eyes too wide open, taking in more than any child should, cataloging the world with an efficiency that bordered on compulsive. In school, she was the girl who could tell when the teacher was lying about being fine, when the boy in the back row had been crying before class, when the lunch lady put extra food on the plates of the kids who looked too thin. She did not do anything with these observations. She just collected them, stacked them neatly in her mind, and carried on. The king was the most interesting collection she had ever started. It began with the mouths. Every conversation Alaric had, his gaze locked onto the speaker's lips. Not their eyes, which was where most people looked, not their hands or their posture, their mouths. He tracked lip movements with an intensity that could be mistaken for concentration, for the focused attention of a king who took every word seriously. And maybe that is all it was. Maybe he was just thorough. But then she noticed Graham. Graham was the king's senior advisor, a lean man with a face like a patient fox. He was always near Alaric, always positioned on the king's left side, slightly forward, angled so that his own face was in the king's line of sight. When another person spoke, Graham shifted, tiny movements. A half step here, a rotation of the shoulder there, like a satellite adjusting its orbit. And sometimes, mid-conversation, Graham would make small gestures, a touch to the jaw, a finger tap, a hand that moved to rest on the table in a specific position. Sera watched these gestures the way she watched everything, with the quiet greed of someone who could not stop collecting. On the fourth day, she tested her theory without meaning to. She was restocking the firewood in the king's study, her back to the door, when Graham entered and began speaking to Alaric about a supply shipment from the west. Sera kept working. She made noise. Normal noise, the kind that came from moving logs and arranging kindling. She dropped one log deliberately, not loud, just a solid thud against the stone floor. Alaric did not react. His eyes stayed on Graham. His expression did not change. No flicker, no flinch, no involuntary shift of attention toward the sound. She dropped a second log, heavier this time. The thud echoed. Nothing. Graham noticed. His eyes cut toward Sera for a fraction of a second, then back to Alaric, and his hand moved. 2 fingers tapped the desk. A signal. Sera was sure of it now. A signal that said someone else is in the room, or pay attention, or some other coded message she was not meant to understand. Alaric's posture shifted slightly. He became aware of her, but the awareness came from the signal, not from the sound. Sera finished the firewood and left the room, and her heart was beating in her throat because she understood now. She did not have all the details, did not know how or when or what had happened, but the architecture of the secret was visible to her, the way a building's skeleton becomes visible when you know where to look. The king could not hear. She walked through the palace corridors with this knowledge, sitting in her chest like a live coal. Hot, dangerous. The kind of thing that could burn the carrier worse than anyone else. She went to the servants' quarters and sat on her narrow bed and stared at the wall and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with a secret that could topple a kingdom. Because she understood what it meant. She had grown up with a deaf brother. Danny had been born without hearing, and Sera had learned to sign before she learned to write. She knew the landscape of deafness the way she knew her own home. She recognized the strategies, the compensations, the constant invisible labor of existing in a world that was built for people who could hear. The king was doing all of it, all the time, in front of everyone, and no one had caught it, because no one was looking. Because who would imagine that the Alpha King, the most dominant wolf in the territory, the man whose silence made grown men tremble, could not hear the trembling? Sera kept the secret for 5 days. She cleaned his rooms. She talked to the furniture. She watched him watch her. And she pretended not to notice him watching. And the whole arrangement had the strange, intimate tension of 2 people circling the same truth from opposite sides. On the 6th day, she made a mistake. It was not calculated. She would tell herself later that it was an accident, and it was. But the accident had been building pressure for days, the way water builds behind a dam, until the dam is not the point anymore. The water is the point. She was collecting the silver tea service from the king's study. Alaric was at his desk, writing. His back was angled toward her, not fully turned, but enough that he could not see her face. She lifted the tray. It was heavier than she expected, or her grip was wrong, or the universe simply decided that this was the moment. The tray slipped. It hit the stone floor with a crash that rang through the room like a bell. 3 silver cups bounced and rolled. The teapot lid spun in a circle. The sound was enormous in the quiet study, the kind of sound that makes bones flinch. In the corridor outside, she heard a guard curse. Something scraped, a chair or a weapon. The startled reaction of men who had not expected the noise. Alaric did not move. His pen did not pause, his shoulders did not tighten, his head did not turn. He sat at his desk with the absolute stillness of a man who existed in a world where silver trays could not crash because sound itself did not exist. Sera stared at his back. Her hands were shaking. Not from the dropped tray, from the confirmation. And then Alaric looked up. Not because of the sound, because of the mirror. There was a small mirror on his desk, angled to show the door behind him. A security measure, she realized, so he could see who entered without hearing them approach. And in that mirror, he could see her face. Wide eyes, parted lips, the unmistakable expression of someone who had just watched a theory become a fact. Their eyes met in the mirror, his reflection and her reality, separated by glass and silence, and a secret that had just lost its last wall. She saw fear, genuine, unguarded, bone-deep fear, the kind she had only ever seen on her brother's face when other children surrounded him in the schoolyard, mouths moving, words flying, and Danny trapped in a glass box he could not break. The king was afraid of her. The most powerful man in the kingdom was terrified of a 23-year-old maid who talked to curtains. Sera bent down, picked up the tray, collected the cups and the teapot lid, set everything back on the silver surface with hands that were no longer shaking, because she had decided something in the span of those 3 seconds. She set the tray on the side table. She turned to face the king's desk, even though he was still looking at her through the mirror and not directly. And she said nothing. She did not say, "I know." She did not say, "Your secret is safe." She did not say anything, because she understood, from years with Danny, that the moment belonged to him. The deaf person decided when and how the conversation happened, not the hearing one. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. She curtsied. She left. And Alaric sat alone in his study, in a silence that had been his constant companion for 11 years. And for the first time, the silence felt like it was holding its breath. 2 days passed before Alaric summoned her. Sera had been expecting it. She had spent those 2 days working with a meticulous calm that did not match the storm inside her head. She cleaned the rooms. She talked to the furniture, because stopping would signal that something had changed, and she understood instinctively that the king had people watching her now, testing her, waiting to see if the maid would run to someone with what she knew. She did not run. She did not tell. She went about her days and kept the coal in her chest and let it burn quietly. The summons came through Lucy, the head housekeeper, who delivered it with the kind of rigid formality that suggested she had no idea what it was about, but deeply resented not knowing. Sera followed Lucy through the corridors to the throne room, and with every step, she rehearsed what she would say. The throne room was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, stone walls carved with wolf motifs, banners hanging from iron rods that looked like they could double as weapons. The throne itself sat on a raised platform, and Alaric was in it, dressed in formal black, the crown of the Alpha resting on his head like it had been forged there. 2 guards flanked the doors. Graham stood to the king's left, in his usual position, his face perfectly neutral. Nate, the second advisor, stood to the right. Sera had seen Nate before, but never this close. He was younger than Graham, broader, with the watchful eyes of a man whose job was to notice threats. He noticed Sera the way he would notice a wasp that had entered through a window. Potential sting, assess and monitor. Sera walked to the center of the room and stopped. She did not curtsy. This was not a cleaning assignment. This was an interrogation, and curtsying at an interrogation felt like admitting guilt before the question was asked. Alaric spoke. His voice filled the room with that slightly flat, slightly wide quality she now understood. He was speaking from memory, from the vibrations he had trained into his throat, not from the feedback loop of hearing his own voice and adjusting. You have been assigned to my private quarters for 9 days. During that time, you may have formed impressions or observations about the routines and habits of my household. I want to be clear that any such observations are confidential by the terms of your employment, and that sharing them with anyone, for any reason, would constitute a breach that carries severe consequences. It was a speech, rehearsed, polished, every word chosen to be readable on his own lips if he had to practice it in the mirror, which he probably had. The message was simple: shut your mouth or lose everything. Sera stood in the center of the throne room and looked at the king and felt two things at once. She felt the fear he intended her to feel, the weight of the crown and the guards and the stone walls and the power that radiated from a man who had held a kingdom together through sheer, stubborn, brilliant deception for over a decade. And she felt something else, something that had no name, a tenderness so unexpected that it almost knocked her sideways. Because she saw Danny. She saw her little brother in the rigid posture and the careful speech, and the eyes that tracked mouths because ears had failed. She saw the boy who had cried into his pillow every night for a year when he was 7, because the world was a movie playing on mute and nobody had given him subtitles. She did not cry, she did not soften, she did something that no one in the room expected, least of all Alaric. She raised her hands, and she signed. Her fingers moved with the fluency of someone who had been signing since childhood, the gestures clean and fast and sure. She signed directly to the king, knowing his eyes would follow because eyes always followed movement, and she said the thing she had decided to say 2 days ago in the kitchen while staring at a wall. I know you cannot hear me right now. You are reading my lips, and you have been reading lips for years, and you are remarkable at it. But I am not going to speak. I am going to sign. Because this is a conversation that should happen in your language, not mine. And I want you to know that your secret is yours. It is not mine to tell. It has never been mine to tell. I will walk out of this room and I will clean your chambers tomorrow morning, and I will talk to your curtains about how ugly they are. And nothing will change, because nothing needs to change. The silence in the throne room was absolute. Graham's face had gone white. Nate's hand had moved halfway to his weapon before he caught himself, because a maid raising her hands was not an attack, but his reflexes did not care about context. The guards at the door stood frozen, understanding nothing, sensing everything. Alaric stared at her hands. He had not seen sign language since his mother died. Margaret had taught him the basics, the emergency signals, the alphabet, enough to communicate critical information in silence. But Margaret's signing had been rough, improvised, the signing of a woman who had learned it out of desperation and used it as a tool of survival. Sera's signing was different. It was native, fluid, the difference between someone reading a poem aloud from a page and someone reciting it from the heart. He did not sign back. He did not know enough to sign back, not with any speed or coherence, and the realization that he lacked the vocabulary to respond in the language she was offering him was a specific kind of grief he had never anticipated. A door had opened and he did not have the legs to walk through it. He dismissed her. The word came out colder than he intended, clipped and royal, the reflex of a man who had been cornered and could only respond with authority. You are dismissed. Sera lowered her hands. She looked at him for one more second, and in that second, something passed between them that neither of them could have named, and neither of them would forget. Then she curtsied, because this time it was not an interrogation anymore, and she left. The doors closed. Graham spoke immediately, but Alaric was not looking at him. He was looking at the space where Sera had stood, the empty center of the throne room, and his hands were resting on the arms of the throne, and his fingers were trembling in a way they had not trembled since he was 14 years old, and the healers told his mother the damage could not be undone. Nate moved into his line of sight. She is a liability. We should transfer her to the outer household, tonight. Alaric read the words and shook his head. She stays. Nate's jaw tightened. My king. She knows. If she tells anyone, if she tells even one person, the chain reaction will reach Fenwick within days. You understand what he will do with this information. She stays. Graham, who had known Alaric longer than anyone alive, studied the king's face. What he saw there made him swallow whatever argument he had prepared. He had served this man for 11 years. He had watched Alaric navigate a world of silence with a discipline that bordered on inhuman. He had never once seen the king's hands shake. Graham nodded. She stays. The days that followed were the strangest of Alaric's reign. Sera returned to her duties as if the throne room confrontation had never happened. She cleaned, she dusted. She told the bronze wolf on the side table that it still looked constipated and that no amount of polishing was going to fix its attitude. But something was different. Small things. She made sure she always entered his field of vision before approaching. She never spoke to him from behind. When she needed his attention, she tapped the surface nearest to him, a desk or a table or a wall, so he would feel the vibration and turn. These were the habits of someone who had lived with deafness. Not learned about it, lived with it. The adjustments were automatic, unconscious, the muscle memory of a girl who had grown up shaping her world around a brother who could not hear it. Alaric watched these small accommodations with the fascination of a man who had never been accommodated. His mother had trained him to pass, to perform hearing, to be so good at the simulation that the simulation became his identity. No one in his life, not Graham, not Nate, not Ruth, had ever adjusted the world to meet him. They had always helped him adjust himself to meet the world. Sera did not help him pass. She met him where he was. And then she began to sign. It started small. She would be cleaning the shelf behind his desk, and she would sign a word. Just one. Dust. Or rain, if it was raining. Or tired, if she could see the fatigue in his posture. She signed the way someone might hum, almost unconsciously, the way her hands naturally spoke when her mouth was not performing for an audience. Alaric began watching for the signs, the way a man in the desert watches for water. The first time he signed back, it was an accident. She had signed the word cold, rubbing her arms with a grin because the study fireplace had gone out, and his hand moved before his brain caught up. He signed back, yes, the simplest gesture, a fist nodding downward, and then froze, because he had just communicated in a language he had been forbidden from using since childhood. Sera saw the freeze. She did not comment on it. She did not smile or celebrate or make the moment bigger than it was. She just nodded and went back to cleaning. And Alaric felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in a wall he had spent 11 years reinforcing. Over the following weeks, the cracks multiplied. Sera started signing full observations during her cleaning shifts, small things at first, gossip from the household, which servants were feuding, which cook was stealing butter from the pantry. Then bigger things. She signed about the ambassador from the Northern Ridge, the one who had insulted Alaric in council. She had overheard him in the kitchens, boasting to his own staff about how Fenwick had promised him a seat on the new council once the current king was removed. Alaric stared at her hands as she signed this. A seat on the new council. The words landed like stones in still water. How do you know this? He asked, speaking aloud, because his signing vocabulary was still too limited for complex conversation. She signed back, slower now, so he could follow. I was refilling the water pitchers in the east corridor. They did not notice me. Nobody notices the cleaning staff. We are furniture to them. Furniture that hears everything. There it was, the strategic value of a maid who could sign. She moved through the palace invisible, beneath the attention of every political player, and she had ears where Alaric did not. Not figuratively, literally. She could hear the conversations he could never access, the whispered plots and muttered complaints and casual treacheries that happened in corridors and kitchens and stairwells, the spaces where real politics lived. She became his ears, not by assignment, by choice. Every evening, when she returned for the second cleaning, she signed to him the things she had heard during the day. Council members who contradicted their public positions in private, servants who were being paid by outside houses for information, guards whose loyalty had been purchased with Fenwick's money. Alaric absorbed this intelligence with the hunger of a man who had been operating with half a map for over a decade. He had always known his information was incomplete. He could only gather intelligence from formal meetings, where faces were visible and lips were readable. Everything else, the murmured asides, the corridor conversations, the kitchen gossip, had been invisible to him. A king who could not eavesdrop was a king operating blind in one eye. Sera gave him the other eye. Their communication grew. Alaric practiced signing in his private hours, using a book Sera had somehow acquired from outside the palace, a children's primer for sign language, with illustrated hands on every page. The book was meant for 6-year-olds. The Alpha King sat in his study after midnight, working through lessons designed for first graders, and the absurdity of it was not lost on him. But the absurdity was also the only thing keeping the grief at bay. Because learning this language he should have known his whole life, this language his mother had forbidden because it would mark him as broken, was the most painful kind of joy he had ever experienced. Meanwhile, Fenwick moved. Lord Fenwick controlled the Western territories with a grip that looked like generosity and functioned like a vice. He funded local schools and healing clinics and community halls, and in exchange, every wolf in those territories owed him something. The debt was never spoken. It did not need to be. Fenwick had built an economy of obligation, and now he was spending it. He had been placing his people inside the palace for over a year. A guard here, a stable hand there, a kitchen worker who reported every meal the king ate, and every visitor who came to the private quarters. The network was patient, professional, and nearly invisible. Nearly. Sera found the first thread because she was looking for butter theft, and found treason instead. The kitchen worker, a quiet man named Peter who peeled vegetables and said very little, had been seen passing notes to a rider who came to the service gate every Thursday. Sera had noticed Peter because he was the only kitchen worker who never complained. Everyone in that kitchen complained. It was their art form, their poetry, their reason for breathing. Peter's silence was a flag, and flags were things Sera collected the way other people collected stamps. She followed the notes. Not physically, she was not a spy, but she watched, and she listened, and she pieced together that Peter was reporting the king's daily schedule to someone outside the palace, and that someone was connected to a house in the Western Territories, and the Western Territories belonged to Fenwick. She signed this to Alaric on a cold evening in his study, her hands moving with the urgency of someone who understood that information had a shelf life. Alaric read her signs and felt the ground shift beneath him. He had suspected Fenwick's ambition. He had not known it had already entered his walls. He wanted to act immediately. Dismiss Peter. Arrest the rider. Send a message. But Sera signed the word wait, and then she signed the word watch, and she was right. Pulling one thread would alert Fenwick that his network had been detected. Better to know the shape of the web before cutting any strand. So they watched. Together. Alaric from his formal positions of power, reading lips and posture, and the surface of every political interaction, and Sera, from the invisible spaces, hearing the words that were never meant for any king's ears. They were a system, imperfect, strange, held together by a secret and a shared language, and the growing, terrifying, unspoken reality that they needed each other in ways that had nothing to do with espionage, and everything to do with the simple human ache of being truly known. And then Fenwick's people found Sera. It happened on a Thursday. She was carrying linens through the East Corridor, the same corridor where she had first overheard the ambassadors boasting, and two men stepped out of a side room and blocked her path. They were not guards. They wore servant clothes, but their posture was wrong, too straight, too controlled, the posture of men who had been trained for something other than domestic work. One of them spoke. His voice was calm, conversational, the kind of calm that is more frightening than shouting, because it suggests the speaker has already decided how this encounter ends. You spend a lot of time in the king's quarters, he said, more time than a maid needs. People have noticed. Sera held the linens against her chest. Her heart was hammering, but her face stayed neutral, because growing up with Danny had taught her to keep her expressions controlled. Danny could read faces the way most people read books, and lying to him required a level of facial discipline that most people never developed. That discipline was saving her now. I clean his rooms twice a day, she said. That is my assignment. The second man stepped closer. Your assignment takes 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening. You are in those rooms for 2 hours at a time. We know because we count. They were counting. Fenwick's people were timing her visits. The web was closer than she had realized. The king's quarters are large, she said, and the previous maid kept them poorly. I have a lot of ground to cover. The first man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. The maid who stays too close to the king should consider staying far away. That is friendly advice. From friends. He touched her arm as he passed. Not a grab, a press. Firm enough to leave a mark. Gentle enough to deny as accidental. The message was delivered in the bruise, not the words. Sera walked back to her quarters, with the linens still pressed against her chest, and the bruise already forming on her upper arm, a blue-green bloom that pulsed with her heartbeat. She did not tell Alaric. She cleaned his rooms that evening, with her sleeves pulled down and her signs limited to the intelligence she had gathered, a new name connected to Fenwick's network, a meeting scheduled between two council members who were supposed to be on opposing sides. She delivered the information and she left, and she sat in the kitchen at 3 in the morning with a cold cloth pressed against her arm because the bruise had swollen and the cold was the only thing keeping the fear from expanding to fill her whole body. That was where Alaric found her. He had not been able to sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep required a kind of surrender that did not come easily to a man who had spent his life maintaining control over every visible aspect of his existence. He walked the palace at night sometimes, following the vibrations of the building, the distant thuds of doors and footsteps transmitted through stone and wood, navigating his home by feel in the dark. He found her by the kitchen fire, which had burned down to embers, her sleeve pushed up, the cold cloth on her arm, her face turned toward the dying light. She did not hear him enter. For once, she was the one who was surprised. He saw the bruise. Even in the low light, the discoloration was visible against her skin, a dark spread of damage that spoke louder than any words. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Alaric raised his hands and signed. His signing was still clumsy. The shapes were approximate, the transitions rough, the grammar of a man working from a children's book and sheer determination. But the words were clear. Who did this? Sera looked at his hands. She looked at his face. And the tenderness she had felt in the throne room weeks ago returned with a force that made her eyes sting. She signed back, "It does not matter. It matters to me." The 4 words hung in the air between them, visible in the movement of his hands, as real as any spoken sentence. More real maybe, because spoken words disappeared into silence the moment they were uttered, but signed words existed in space, in the memory of motion, and Alaric's hands were still holding the shape of the last sign, as if he could not bear to let the sentence go. Sera told him. She signed the encounter, the 2 men, the warning, the bruise. She signed it clinically, without embellishment, because embellishment was for the curtain monologues, and this was something else entirely. Alaric watched her hands and felt the anger arrive. It came the way it always came, not as an explosion, but as a settling, a familiar weight dropping into place, like a key into a lock. Anger was the thing he knew. Anger was the tool he reached for, when every other emotion was too large, too formless, too dangerous to hold. Anger had edges. Anger had direction. Anger was a known country with maps and roads, and he could navigate it with his eyes closed. He signed one word, stay. Sera looked at him. Stay? Stay. He signed it again, and his hands were steady now, the anger giving them the precision that grief and tenderness could not. Here, in the palace, in my quarters, do not let them drive you out. She signed back, with the ghost of a smile that was braver than anything he had ever done on his throne. I was not planning on leaving. I still have to tell your curtains they are ugly. He almost laughed again. The sound stayed behind his teeth, but the almost was there, and she saw it on his face, and she did not make it bigger than it was. They sat in the kitchen as the embers died, 2 people in a castle built for hundreds, sharing a silence that had become, against every logical expectation, the most honest conversation either of them had ever had. In the morning, Alaric called Graham and Nate into his study. He told them about the encounter in the corridor. He told them Fenwick's network had identified Sera as a person of interest. He told them this meant Fenwick's people were watching the king's quarters closely enough to count minutes. Graham's response was strategic. They needed to identify every compromised member of the household staff, map Fenwick's network, and begin counter-surveillance without alerting the targets. Nate's response was direct. Fenwick is preparing something. The surveillance is not passive. He is building a case, building toward a move. Alaric agreed. The question was what move, and when. The answer came 12 days later, delivered in the most public way possible. Lord Fenwick arrived at the palace with an entourage of 40 wolves, a formal delegation that could not be refused entry without causing a diplomatic crisis. He requested an audience with the full council. He was granted one, and in that audience, in front of every political figure of consequence in the kingdom, he invoked the old law, the right of challenge. It was an ancient tradition, almost forgotten, buried in the legal archives like a bone beneath centuries of sediment. Any wolf of noble blood could challenge the Alpha King's fitness to rule by invoking the right of challenge, a formal contest held in the public arena before witnesses from every territory. The challenger would make an accusation, the king would respond, the council would judge. The critical detail, the detail that made Alaric's blood run cold when Graham signed the key points to him after the session, was the format. The accusation would be spoken aloud. The king's response had to be immediate, verbal, and unaided. No advisors, no written statements, no prepared remarks. The tradition was designed to test the raw fitness of the alpha, to strip away the machinery of government, and expose the man underneath. A man who could not hear the accusation could not respond to it. Fenwick did not know for certain that Alaric was deaf, but he suspected. He had gathered enough threads to pull, enough observations from enough compromised servants to construct a theory, and the right of challenge was the perfect test. If Alaric was hearing, he would respond, and Fenwick's challenge would fail publicly. If Alaric was deaf, the failure to respond would expose everything. It was a trap with no visible walls. Walk in and you reveal yourself. Refuse to enter and you confirm the suspicion. The arena date was set. 14 days. Alaric sat in his study that night and felt the walls closing in. 11 years of deception. 11 years of lip-reading and signals and the constant, exhausting performance of being a hearing man. And it was all converging on a single point in time. A single moment when he would stand in an arena and either speak or be silent. And either way, the truth would find its way into the light. Sera came for the evening cleaning. She saw his face and set down her supplies and signed. What happened? He told her. He signed it slowly, carefully, because the language was still new, and the content was heavy, and his hands wanted to shake, but he would not let them. Sera listened with her eyes. When he finished, she stood very still for a long time. Then she signed 2 words. We fight. Sera's plan was built on a single insight that no one in Alaric's inner circle had considered because they had spent 11 years thinking about the deafness as a weakness to be hidden. She wanted to make it a weapon. Alaric told her she was out of her mind. He said it out loud, in his slightly flat voice, because the magnitude of his disagreement exceeded his signing ability. Graham, when he was briefed, said nothing for 30 seconds, which was the Graham equivalent of screaming. Nate suggested, with barely concealed frustration, that perhaps the maid should return to her cleaning duties and leave strategy to people who had not been scrubbing floors 6 weeks ago. Sera looked at Nate. She signed something to Alaric. Alaric's mouth twitched. What did she say? Nate asked. You do not want to know, Alaric said. The plan was this. Fenwick expected one of 2 outcomes. Either Alaric would respond to the verbal accusation, proving he could hear and deflating the challenge, or Alaric would fail to respond, proving he could not hear and triggering a crisis. Fenwick had built his entire strategy around the binary, hear or not hear, pass or fail. Sera's plan broke the binary. Do not hide it, she signed, her hands moving with a conviction that filled the room. Do not respond as if you can hear. Respond as what you are. Tell them. Stand in that arena and tell every wolf in the kingdom the truth. Not because they caught you, because you chose to speak. Alaric stared at her. The idea was so far outside the walls of his reality that it did not register as an idea at first. It registered as an attack. 11 years of hiding. 11 years of his mother's voice in his memory. If they find out, they will tear you from the throne. 11 years of building a perfect simulation of a hearing king. And this girl, this maid, this woman who talked to curtains and signed like she was born with the language in her bones, was asking him to burn it all down. They will remove me, he said. Will they? She signed. You have ruled this kingdom for 11 years. The borders are secure. The trade routes are open. The treasury is stable. What will they say you did wrong? I lied. You survived. There is a difference. The argument lasted 3 days. It happened in fragments. Signed conversations during cleaning shifts, whispered debates in the study at midnight, a furious exchange in the kitchen at dawn where Alaric signed so forcefully that he knocked a cup off the counter and Sera caught it, without breaking eye contact, because she had grown up catching things Danny knocked over, and the reflex was encoded in her muscles. Graham came around first. He was a strategist, and once he set aside the panic, he could see the geometry of Sera's plan. Fenwick's power lay in the secret. The secret was leverage. Remove the secret, and you remove the leverage. A king who confesses cannot be exposed. A king who stands up and says, I have been deaf for 11 years and I ruled you anyway, is not a king caught in a lie. He is a king who just redefined the terms. Nate came around last. He did not like the plan. He did not trust the plan, but he trusted Alaric, and Alaric had made a decision, and Nate's loyalty was not conditional on agreement. The 14 days passed with the compressed intensity of a countdown. Alaric continued his public schedule, attending council sessions, receiving delegations, performing the role of the hearing king for what he knew would be the final time. Every lip-read conversation, every perfectly timed response, every signal from Graham carried the weight of an ending. Sera worked alongside him in the private hours, drilling him on the speech he would give. Not the words. The words were his. She drilled him on the delivery. She had spent years watching Danny navigate a hearing world, and she knew the specific challenges of a deaf person speaking to a large crowd. The volume modulation, the pacing, the tendency to speed up when nervous, because there was no auditory feedback to regulate tempo. She stood across the study and held up her hands, palms facing him, and he spoke, and she signed adjustments in real time. Slower, louder, breathe. She was conducting him like an orchestra, and the patience required was enormous, and she never once lost it. On the 12th night, Alaric asked her a question. He signed it, because the question was too important for the imperfect vehicle of his voice. "Why are you doing this?" She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She thought about Danny, who was 16 now, and brilliant and brave and still living in a world that treated his deafness as a deficit. She thought about Ruth, who had kept the secret out of love and loyalty, and who had died carrying a weight that was never hers to bear. She thought about Alaric, who had been 14 years old and bleeding and terrified, and who had responded to the worst moment of his life by becoming the most disciplined man she had ever encountered. She signed back. "Because you asked for someone invisible, and invisible people see everything. And what I see is a king who deserves to be heard, even if he cannot hear." Alaric looked at her hands, and the words they made in the air, and he felt the hairline fractures in his chest connect and spread, and the wall that had held for 11 years began to fall, not with a crash, but with the slow, quiet, irreversible patience of ice melting. He reached out and took her hand, not to sign, just to hold. She let him. The morning of the challenge arrived with the kind of pale, clean light that made everything look like it had been scrubbed. The arena was an ancient structure on the palace grounds, a circular stone amphitheater that had been used for ceremonies and judgments for centuries. It held 3,000 wolves, and every seat was filled. Fenwick arrived in formal dress, accompanied by his entourage and his allies, a visible coalition of power that stretched across 3 territories. He stood at the center of the arena, with the posture of a man who had already written the next chapter of his story and was now merely waiting for history to catch up. Alaric entered from the royal gate, alone. This was the first breach of expectation. The king always entered with advisors, with guards, with the full apparatus of authority. Alaric walked into the arena by himself, wearing the crown, dressed in black, and the solitude of his entrance made the crowd shift. Something was different. Something was happening that did not follow the script. Graham watched from the royal box. His hands were clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Nate stood beside him, rigid as iron. Sera was in the crowd. She had refused the royal box. She wanted to be where the people were, where she could read the mood, feel the temperature, be close to the ground truth of what was about to happen. Fenwick began. He spoke with the polished confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment until it was as natural as breathing. He laid out the accusation with surgical precision. The Alpha King had concealed a fundamental incapacity. He could not hear. He had deceived the kingdom, the council, the allied territories, and every wolf who had placed their trust in his leadership. This deception was not a personal matter. It was a matter of security, of trust, of the sacred bond between an alpha and his people. Alaric stood 10 feet away and watched Fenwick's lips form every word. He read the accusation as it was delivered, each sentence landing in his mind through the pathway of vision rather than sound, the same pathway he had used for 11 years to govern a kingdom that never suspected. Fenwick finished. The arena was silent. 3,000 wolves waited. This was the moment, the binary that Fenwick had constructed: respond or fail, hear or do not hear. Alaric stepped forward. He did not look at Fenwick. He looked at the crowd. He found Sera's face in the 3rd row, a small face among hundreds, and she was not signing, she was not signaling, she was just looking at him, Her eyes steady, her hands still. He spoke. Lord Fenwick is correct. The three words detonated in the silence. A ripple of sound moved through the crowd, the kind of collective intake that sounds like wind and feels like an earthquake. Alaric continued. His voice was steady. The pacing was right. Sera had drilled him for 12 days, and the muscle memory held. I have been deaf since I was 14 years old. The siege that killed my father left me without hearing. I have not heard a single word spoken in this kingdom for 11 years. Not a council debate, not a battle cry. Not a prayer at a pyre. The crowd was motionless. The stillness had the quality of held breath. Thousands of lungs paused mid-cycle. The whole arena suspended between one heartbeat and the next. I concealed this because I was taught to conceal it. I was told that wolves do not follow a leader who is broken. I was told that my deafness was a weakness that would end my line and scatter my people. I believed this. I built my entire reign around this belief. He paused. Not for effect. Because the next words were the hardest words he had ever spoken. Harder than any diplomatic negotiation. Harder than any battle command. Harder than the 11 years of daily performance that had preceded this moment. I was wrong to hide it, but I was not wrong to lead. He let that sentence sit alone. One sentence. Its own moment. In 11 years, the southern border has not been breached. The eastern trade routes generate more revenue than any period in our history. The Treasury holds reserves sufficient for 3 years of emergency provision. The Allied territories have remained allied. The enemies of this kingdom have not gained a single acre of ground. He looked at the crowd, face by face, row by row. These are not the achievements of a hearing king or a deaf king. They are the achievements of a king who did the work, every day, without exception, without rest, without the luxury of hearing a warning shout or a whispered conspiracy, or the sound of his own people calling his name. He turned to Fenwick. You stand here and call this weakness. You stand here and tell these people that a man who ruled a kingdom without one of his senses is unfit. I ask you to consider the opposite. I ask you to consider that any wolf who can do what I have done, with what I have lacked, is exactly the kind of wolf you want on this throne. Fenwick's face had undergone a transformation during the speech. The confident posture had stiffened. The polished composure had developed cracks. He had prepared for confusion, for stammering, for the visible collapse of a deaf man confronted with a spoken accusation he could not process. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for a king who walked into the trap and turned it inside out. Fenwick tried to recover. He spoke about deception, about trust, about the principle that a king who lies about something so fundamental cannot be trusted with anything else. His arguments were sound in the abstract, they had the shape of logic, but the room had shifted, and he was arguing against a tide, because the wolves in the arena were not thinking about deception, they were thinking about the southern border, they were thinking about the trade routes, they were thinking about the fact that their king had been deaf for 11 years, and they had never known, because his rule had given them no reason to question. A king who had fooled an entire kingdom into believing he could hear was not weak. He was the most formidable wolf they had ever encountered. The Elder Council convened in the arena. This was tradition, the formal judgment that followed a challenge. 9 elders, representing the 9 territories, seated in a semicircle of stone chairs that had been carved for this purpose centuries ago. The vote was not unanimous. 3 elders sided with Fenwick, wolves from territories already deep in his pocket, but 6 voted to uphold the throne, and 6 was enough, and the challenge collapsed, not with a battle, but with a count. Fenwick left the arena with his entourage, his posture still rigid, his face still composed, but something had shifted behind his eyes. He had gambled everything on a secret, and the secret had been surrendered voluntarily, and the surrender had turned the weapon against the wielder. The crowd did not cheer. This was not a cheering moment, but they stood as Alaric left the arena, and the standing was enough. That evening, the palace was quiet. Alaric sat in his study. The crown was on the desk beside him, not on his head. The room was lit by the fireplace, and the shadows moved on the walls the way they always moved, silently, part of the soundless world he had inhabited since he was a boy. Sera appeared in the doorway. She had changed from the clothes she had worn in the crowd. Her hair was loose. She looked tired and relieved, and something else, something that had no clean name and did not need one. He looked at her. She walked into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk. Not the maid's stool. The chair. The one Graham used for briefings. The one reserved for equals. They sat in the silence for a long time. Alaric raised his hands and signed. I cannot hear what they are saying about me out there. Sera watched his hands. She smiled. The real one. The one she used when she was talking to the fern. She signed back. They are saying you are the most stubborn wolf who ever lived. A pause. The fire moved. The shadows moved. The silence, for once, did not feel like absence. It felt like a room with exactly enough in it. They are right, she signed. Alaric looked at this woman who had arrived in his life, carrying cleaning supplies and chaos and the specific, irrational bravery of someone who talked to furniture and signed to kings and refused to be invisible even when that was exactly what she had been hired to be. He signed one word. Stay. She signed back. I am not going anywhere. Your curtains still need someone to tell them the truth. The crown sat on the desk between them. The secret was gone. The throne remained. The silence remained too, but it was different now, reshaped, shared, no longer a cage built for one. Outside the study, the palace breathed. Guards walked their routes. Servants finished the evening work. The kingdom carried on, as kingdoms do, indifferent to the private revolution that had taken place within its walls. In the morning, there would be politics. Fenwick would regroup. The council would demand explanations. The allied territories would send letters full of carefully worded concern. The work of ruling would continue, harder in some ways, easier in others, because the truth had a weight of its own, but it was lighter than the lie. But that was the morning. Tonight, there was a fire, and a chair, and a man who could not hear, and a woman who had given him a language, and a silence that belonged to both of them, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.